Thanks very much. Can I mention before I ask Bernadette the first question that just a few hours ago, Mr. Mick Mulvaney, who had been President Trump's special representative for Northern Ireland, has resigned his position with 13 days to go of Trump's office, and he described his position. He said it's a gig. It's not. Somewhere at some other point he said it's really nothing, and so on, which in some ways reflects whether it reflects the wider attachment of the American policy system to issues Irish, I don't know, but I think it was a telling little point. Anyway, having said that, Bernadette, congratulations on your book. I have one of my copies here, well thumbed, I assure you, and we're here to talk about it. So can you I'll ask you a very general question first of all, which is why did you write it?
Oh, the first ones are always the ones that you don't actually think about too much. Well, as you heard there from Liz, and I'm really grateful to Cambridge for publishing this work, I've been working in the area of American-Irish diplomacy for a long number of years, and among the questions that have really become important to me, and which influence this work, related to first of all, how America was perceived and is partly still perceived in Irish foreign policymakers' agenda. And while we used to perhaps applying the term American exceptionalism to US foreign policy, it began to strike me over the years that the Irish adopted a position of exceptionalism as well in relation to their policy and views of America. In other words, it was based on that Irish interests were unique and were distinctive, and that the Americans, indeed, nothing better could happen to them than to respond to Irish interests. And then on the other side, what I wanted to look at was to place Ireland actually in American foreign policy priorities, and to deal in particular with this view that the State Department was particularly Anglophone and Anglophile, and that that in a sense, at particular periods, that it was opposed to Irish interests and overly influenced, obviously, by British foreign policy. I suppose rising from that then would be why the 1930s. And it's not obvious why the 1930s really, except that for the reasons that the 1930s seems to be between two wars and the interwar period. That in fact indeed one of the first Irish US minister appointed to Ireland, Frederick Sterling, made it quite clear that Ireland was a fine place to be, but there was mighty little of real work to be done there. And so therefore, that's another reason perhaps for not examining the period at all. And of course, it seemed that a large, powerful state and a small state, that there was very little really that would have upset that relationship. However, when you look more closely at the 1930s, obviously the events of the Second World War in particular, it doesn't occur in isolation. There is a context to it. Obviously, the 1930s in itself is bookended by the Wall Street crash, and then by Roosevelt coming into office and the installation of the New Deal. So in itself, it is a period that is fraught with crises, which interested me. The final factor, I think, for looking at the 1930s and why it interested me was, of course, the arrival of Éamon de Valera into office in 1932. And that de Valera himself, perhaps, and as other scholars have identified and agreed, indeed, beginning with Owen Dudley Edwards, would be accepted the idea that de Valera had this mythical-like view of America. And that fed into my whole idea around Irish exceptionalism in relation to America. So in a sense, the short answer really is that the 1932-39 period seemed to offer a lot of scope for examining themes within Irish foreign policy, which were only present within that specific period.
Sorry, I'm having kitten troubles here. But but it seems to me also that one of the things your book does, which I think, which is why it's not simply about Ireland and America, but it's about the American foreign policy system, is the extent to which, and in some ways it's a reflection also of the Irish, but the extent to which America, although isolationist in principle, has this enormous, not so much diplomatic, but consular. You have a very dramatic figure, I think, for the early 20s, consular footprint, where there's far more consuls than there are diplomats, and they're right across the world. And to some extent, they're doing what still in American foreign policy, if you ask me, is the big deal in America, which is they're doing trade. And yes, they're getting sailors out of jail and things as well, but they're really there for trade, and they're all over the place. And your earlier work, that's why when you worked on consul, and I think the part of the value of work, honestly, is it's about the American foreign policy system and practice in a supposed era of isolation, just as much as it is about bilateral relations from an Irish angle.
That's right. And I mean, in fact, there were more American consular officers in Ireland than there were Irish consular officers based in America for a period, which was, quite an irony given the greatest difference in the size of populations and of the constituencies that they would be dealing with. But that raises, I think, another point, which is that I have a chapter in the book on that nitty-gritty day-to-day work, the immigration work, which the Irish consular officers in the US had to deal with. And after 1930, when the British and Irish government agreed that the Irish consular system, such as it was, would take over the British consular work dealing with Irish citizens in America, you had the consular officers in New York. You had one in Chicago eventually, one in Boston eventually, one in San Francisco. That's 4, plus the minister, 5, who had to take over the work of over 60 British consular officers. And so their workload in that period was enormous. In addition to the immigration stuff, they then, as you said, had the trade stuff to deal with. In addition then to policy, etc., because those consular officers were so isolated in a way that they also operated as diplomats. So now when you look at the reverse of that, when you look at the American consular officers in Ireland, their workload is decreasing as the 1930s goes on, and really only picks up again in 1939 when war breaks out. But yet and obviously there was a consul general in Belfast. There was an office in Dublin. There had been one in Cork, obviously out in Cove, and then retreated to Cork, and then from Cork back to Dublin, where the visas would be issued. And then there was an honorary consul over in Galway. So the consular service, when you look at and place in context the work of the Irish consular service, it really is quite astonishing, because consular work, as you said, is such detailed work and so important for the day-to-day relationship. I regard it as the substance, because they deal with human beings. They're dealing with people's problems of the relationship, really, the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, and they're dealing with a lot of not only the Irish, but the American, with a huge amount of citizen casework type stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they're dealing with the Irish in America, well, both sets of officers. They're dealing with deportation cases, they're dealing with extradition cases, they're dealing with distress cases, compensation cases. So there's a lot of work that they have to engage in, and then, of course, estate cases. And because of that size of Irish America, over 20 million, going back 3rd, 4th generations by the 1930s, that work is extensive. And for the consular officers, the Irish consular officers, it's the way they actually can be justified financially, because they take a commission from a lot of state work that they engage in.
And of course, by doing that, they were taking revenue from the British intelligence, because some of the passport control revenue after the First World War was diverted to augment the budget of MI6. That's only a passing point. Okay, we'll go on to sort of bigger issues in a minute, but even on the American side, one of the key things about your book seems to me, and I think I mentioned I was talking to a former Irish ambassador to the United States who wasn't surprised at all when I said it to him, but how difficult and how irritating on the American side, so many things that the Irish took they could do for granted, such as obviously the sweepstake is one, the complications around the Doyle loan and so on, and all that is another. Would you say a bit about that? Because it wasn't just the foreign policy people who were involved.
Yeah, and this is, in a sense, my argument around exceptionalism. When you look at the nitty-gritty and the detail of the State Department involvement with Irish representatives in the US, obviously going from Michael McWhite and then into Robert Brennan. I mean, and they are irritants, and they do pile up in a sense. I mean, the ongoing issue was obviously, as you mentioned there, the Irish hospital sweepstake, which obviously the work of Marie Coleman and Gavin Wilk has been so important on. But when you look at the State Department files, what the issue becomes there for them is that the sweepstake people based in Dublin, who, for those perhaps who may not be familiar, it was a system, what would you call it, Eunan? It was a project that was set up, a policy decision initially, as a way of gathering money for particularly the building of hospital infrastructure in Ireland. And the thing was,
for the McGrath family, of course, who owned it.
Yeah, exactly. They sell tickets. You sell tickets, books of tickets in America and throughout the whole of the diaspora. People buy the tickets. And it's a ticket for a horse that will be running in a sweepstake race. So it started off small with perhaps only, I think it was only about $1 million that came back from the States in terms of the proceeds of selling the tickets in 1931. It ends up by 1939 into 18 million that's coming back. And so therefore, but remember the point, the sweepstake it's a lottery and it's illegal in American states. And it's also illegal to use the US Postal Service. Yeah. So what you happen are these people getting these packets and packets of tickets to sell that are the hundreds of thousands of them, millions probably, that are, and they then begin to complain to the State Department. Where's this stuff coming from? Is this not illegal? And one of the best cases was a packet of tickets that was sent from Thomas Harris in Clara, County Offaly, and some of us will be familiar with Clara, is where one of our former Taoiseach came from. And the tickets arrive on the desk of FDR, and the accompanying letter says, Mr. President, would you mind selling these 12 tickets? You can, and please be sure to send back the £6. You make 2 tickets of your own, but I want the rest back. So after a short period in 1932-33, what you had was the post office, you had the US Customs, and you had the Treasury, all complaining to the State Department and asking it over a period of 5 years at least to make an official protest to the Irish government to stop this. So that was one source of irritation. And they don't make that formal protest, which is eventually made until 1938 when Cudahy arrives and he goes off and has a chat with De Valera, Joe McGrath you mentioned, and Joe Walsh. The other aspect of the irritant then, I think, is the Doyle-Éamon loan repayment. Now, that should have been a good news story, because under that scheme, where the De Valera government decides to repay and sets aside a budgetary portion to repay loans that had been money that had been lent by Irish Americans and Americans during the revolutionary period to fund the new Doyle-Éamon. And those eventually, after court cases, that money had to be repaid. De Valera eventually decides and puts legislation through. And in 1934, they start off the Doyle loan repayment. As I said, should have been a good news story. But you then had, once the newspapers caught it and started running with it, the New York Times, etc., you then had Irish Americans writing in the whole time to the State Department saying, where's my money? And because the office that was repaying it, in charge of it in New York, was only one man, Garth Healy, and some secretarial assistants, he only sends back the bunch in bunches of 20,000 the names he has verified of people who are owed money. So in between the batches going off, you had a lot of people getting extremely frustrated and annoyed, and particularly because the Depression is still hitting and looking for their money. So that was another source of irritation. And just one other one I'll mention would be the constant language and references picked up by the De Valera government. Any reference that came out of any American official document or the mouth of any American government official or FDR, Hull, anybody that did not separate Ireland out from the Commonwealth or from Great Britain, the Irish government picked up on it.
Yeah.
And Pierpont Moffat in particular, who becomes chief of the European division in the State Department, gets extremely frustrated by this. So there's a lot of irritants. They may seem small, they're not big policy issues, but they do build up in terms of creating annoyance about the way the Irish government is operating. And that's the climate within which particularly Michael McWhite tried to operate and behave as a diplomat in a diplomatic fashion.
And McWhite's a very interesting figure, just to mention him because of his background as having fought in the French Foreign Legion and so on, and his experience in the League of Nations. He actually comes to Washington, it seems to be, with a lot of friends, not so much in America, but people elsewhere in international diplomacy who end up, getting rotated through Washington during his time. So in some ways he's in some ways a very conventional international diplomat. And there's a contrast, or is there, between him and Robert Brennan, who succeeds him, who really was a revolutionary propagandist, but he wasn't a serious diplomat. Could you comment on the contrast?
Yeah, you make a very important point there, because I think the Robert Brennan, as we know, revolutionary, but really his background was newspaper and propaganda. And even though he is in the States from 1934 on, I mean, as we know, there was very little victimization from De Valera in terms of the civil service, and he didn't attempt to, replace existing men from the Cosgrave government. But one of the people who is replaced into the civil service is Brennan, and he puts him in as secretary of delegation. So Brennan is actually in the States quite a long period before he becomes minister, when he replaces McWhite. But yet the contrast between the two men is quite amazing. In that Brennan really does not have the skills to operate in the diplomatic environment. And even when you look at the way he's presented in newspapers and in social columns, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, but particularly the Washington newspapers from the beginning, there was a dedicated column to the activities of diplomats and the diplomatic corps in Washington. And Brennan will feature in that. When he becomes minister, it's like as if he's suddenly come from Ireland. There's no context on him at all. So really, he made very little imprint as secretary in the legation. As minister, the focus the whole time is on his colourful background, that he'd been in prison, that he'd been a revolutionary, that he was a frank speaker, and that he didn't wear the frock coat of diplomacy very well. And that becomes problematic very quickly, even though he does develop a good relationship with British Ambassador Lindsay on a personal level. It's clear very early on that he does not have the skills, or indeed isn't able to cultivate the relationships within the State Department on Ireland's behalf. And therefore, he's working on the basis the whole time that the State Department is too Anglophile, A, and B, that they think that the Irish are anti-British. He says, but the reality is that Brennan was anti-British the whole way through. And one of the very small example is in the area of soft diplomacy, where you can see that. The whole way through, the Brennans always had a St. Patrick's Day event in their house. The McWhites never had. And McWhite's wife, Paula, she called in once to the Brennan St. Patrick's Day event. At that event, both Robert and Una, his wife, were speaking Irish, and were very much playing the green card. So the contrast, but what is much more important, I think, is obviously when war hits. And Brennan then has to completely change his focus. And instead of courting Irish America, and his main aim is to put together a united group of Irish Americans, which De Valera doesn't support. He's got to change that focus and instead move to try and create some strategic relationships with Irish Americans, particularly Democrats, and also within the State Department.
There is, I think it's probably what will be your next book, but in Moffat's journal, there's an embarrassing entry early in 1940 where where Moffat recalls notes a conversation, a telephone conversation with Brennan, who was rung up to give the Irish agreement in advance to the appointment of Governor Earl of Pennsylvania, another troublesome place, as the next American minister in Dublin. And Moffat then rings the White House, who say, "What? We haven't done anything like it." So it makes Brennan look at like either trying to bounce them into the appointment and or just a complete idiot and schmuck.
Absolutely. Well, I think all of those, because really, as we know, that is one of the real hard and fast rules of diplomacy. The host government has no say whatsoever in the appointment that's coming towards it, the appointment that's on its way towards it. And so therefore he was breaking all sorts of basic rules, 101 of diplomacy. And he's unable to recognize that. And it's not only to say that the Irish government would like to quickly have a replacement for, it was John Cudahy who went in January 1940, but giving a specific name of somebody. This is the guy we want. He also said in that he wanted a replacement for a consul general that was leaving, and they wanted him replaced immediately. So now that wasn't the first time that the Irish had made clear, and I just go back for a little bit and try to influence appointments. After Sterling went in 33 into 34, there were over 100 Irish Americans and Americans who were interested in coming to Ireland, and within the list were two women, Mary Harriman Ramsay and Florence Harriman. And the Irish, Michael McWhite, on instruction from Dublin, very quickly beetles off to the State Department and lets them very clearly informs them that Ireland really does not want a female diplomat in any way. So there was a little precedent for Robert Brennan's intervention later on, but I mean, obviously the timing, the content, the approach, the tone of Brennan's was obviously much more a significant intervention.
Yeah. Can we talk a bit now about the Americans who either by choice or by accident sort of end up in Dublin for a period of years, and not only their career expectations, but also the Irish expectations of them, socially as well as, and culturally, if you like, as well as politically?
Yeah. Well, obviously the premier posting from Washington right throughout the period was obviously the Court of St. James. And certainly not Dublin, and Dublin was certainly way down the line. However, as I just said in reference to the two women who were applying for the Irish job, Sterling was the first guy who was appointed as a minister, and he's appointed in 1927, even though diplomatic relations were established in 1924. And he's there from 27 to 34. He then is replaced by a guy called William MacDougall, who's only in place 14 days. Unfortunately, he died in Ireland. He was from Montana. And then the next replacement is a Texan, Alvin Owsley. I just indicate who these guys were first. And then the final guy for the period I'm looking at is John Cudahy, who was from Wisconsin. And these four men, what they all had in common was a strong interest in rural pursuits, hunting and fishing. And Ireland was very much, of all four of them, were hugely interested in the Irish post for that reason. Indeed, Cudahy even took a step backwards because he had been ambassador to Poland and went back into becoming a minister in order to take up the Irish post. So that was one common interest they had in common. De Valera was quite relieved that Owsley was appointed. It meant A, he wasn't getting either of the two women, and B, there was a quick replacement after MacDowell died. But his favourite of them was, of course, John Cudahy. Cudahy came from Callan, County Kilkenny, or his people did. And then, of course, he was obviously Irish American. He was also Catholic. And that was a huge factor for De Valera. He felt that he finally had somebody that he could relate to, he had something in common with, and more importantly, who would understand not just Ireland, but of course, the whole iniquity of partition. and would help to achieve the reunification of Ireland. So from the beginning, he gives Cudahy access to him that none of the others ever have. And he has constant conversations with him. They're long conversations, they're detailed conversations. He's the diplomat he meets the night before he goes off to begin to negotiate the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which ended the Anglo-Irish Economic War. So Cudahy really is important. And when you look at them, he's important in terms of trying to realise, or De Valera beginning to think that some activity would be and some progress would be made in relation to, as I say, the issue of partition. And so, obviously, you mentioned there in social terms, the legation itself, based in the Phoenix Park and very nice house mansion. The legation becomes the centre of diplomatic activity in social terms in Dublin throughout the 1930s. And I've done quite a bit of work on the role of the diplomatic spouse in particular. But what's interesting is that for these four individuals who were there as well, the other lure of Ireland, which isn't political, is that it was close to London. And the attraction of British royalty and the British monarchy and its shenanigans, anybody who's watching series 1 and 2 of The Crown will certainly be aware, and most of us are anyway, of the whole activities around coronations and abdications and Mrs. Simpson, etc., was a fascination for the world at the time. And a lot of these four men and their families certainly hoped and wished that they would be able to visit London much more frequently now that they were based in Ireland. So their reasons for being in Ireland were personal and somewhat political. Though I would have to say that for Cudahy, I think the political is perhaps equal to the personal as well.
And but there's also the issue of career officials. I mean, what happened if you were told you'd be sent to the Dublin legation as the secretary or something? Was that the career kiss of death almost? And was it perceived as such? Because Dublin was such a backwater. I think you said there were 5 diplomatic missions in the mid-30s in Dublin, of which about 3 actually only had charge d'affaires in them.
Yeah, for the more kind of lower level officials, very few of them stayed in Dublin for any length of time. Most of them were moved on very quickly. Their salaries were so pathetic anyway, and the cost of living in Dublin in the 1930s was quite high, that even some of them were living in the Gate Lodge in the legation, the legation residence in the Phoenix Park for a while. And more often than not, the minister would bring with him from wherever he'd been his own private secretary. And so therefore there were even fewer decent opportunities for anyone there. But certainly, yeah, I mean, it was not a decent posting, and it was certainly one that you would just get experience from and then move on.
I'm trying to think, can you think of Loy Henderson, who was a consul, started his career as a consul in Ireland in 1921 or something. But he became the #2 in the State Department in the 60s. But I don't know, are there other people that I don't know about who actually made something of the penance of being posted to independent Ireland?
Nobody who made any great impact in terms of the State Department bureaucracy. Obviously Cudahy, he's moved on and he becomes ambassador to Belgium. He has to leave gone within 18 months after the invasion, comes back to London. Ambassador Kennedy says he's come back in one piece, but mentally he's not. And very soon after that, he goes back to the States, retires, and he actually dies in a riding accident. So no, I mean, none of them are any great shakes. Now, there was hope, for example, that Stirling, he was being considered for a period that he would become chief of a division. They saw him as having that potential. But because when Roosevelt comes in 33, there's a discussion in the State Department about what to do with Stirling for a period of time. And they decide to leave him there because they decide that the room for making mistakes in Ireland and particularly because De Valera is now coming in, was too high, and that you needed somebody who could, you know, have a steady hand. So Sterling
Yeah.
was considered for a while, but then he isn't any after. Once he's moved on, he's moved on. You know?
Yeah. Can I shift the focus over now to some extent, not so much to Anglo-Irish relations, because we're not talking about that, but to how the British read the Irish diplomatic presence in the States. And can I begin by asking about the Catholic question? Because, like, by chance, many years ago, I came across a statement from a retired British diplomat which said that in 1930, the British Foreign Office intended to appoint the Earl of Perth, Sir Eric Drummond, to be the next ambassador in Washington, and the Archbishop of Canterbury intervenes because Drummond was a kind of convert to Catholicism. And there is a thing about Catholicism and the British state generally, which isn't sometimes recognized in these fashionable times. It sends a shiver down the spine. And I just wonder whether to what extent British diplomacy in America tried to address, as it were, what they might see as their Catholic problem relating to, you know, Irish influence and so on. Do we know much about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great strengths of British diplomacy in the States in the 1930s, which was a difficult challenge for the Irish diplomats, was the strength of British propaganda and the British propaganda machine in the States, particularly coming out of the British Library of Information, which was really their propaganda arm in New York, and the resources which it had. So it, along with the British Embassy and all the consular officers around the country, the British, I think, in Washington and, as I say, out in New York, they were able to wage very strong campaigns to create and negotiate relationships with people whom they thought would be useful to them. Now, their strength as well was obviously that they had an in into the State Department, whereas we know in the State Department they were very slow to allow in Catholics, Jews, women. And so therefore there are commonalities which the British enjoy with State Department officials that the Irish can never enjoy. The Irish diplomats in the States, they're also very focused the whole time on establishing relationships with Irish American and building on relationships with Irish American Roman Catholic priests, archbishops, bishops, cardinals, etc. And they do it quite deliberately. And one of the strongest relationships which Mac White has, and Brennan then, is with the papal nuncio in Washington. But it's also a relationship with Lindsay, Ambassador Lindsay has as well. So the British interest, I think, in that kind of Catholic factor, I think is more to be focused on, less in terms of, and I mean, of course, Kennedy was always noted in the Foreign Office as he's Catholic, we're getting a Catholic appointee, but they accept him, you know, because he's coming where he's coming from and whose representative he is. So I don't know that the Catholic factor is particularly strong for the British in the United States, but obviously it's there the whole time undercover, you know. Now, somebody like Father Colin, or Coughlin, you know, I mean, that rabid voice in America, and particularly in American isolationism. But I mean, the Irish government after 1932, I mean, they're also keeping the Irish diplomats, they're also keeping an eye on Father Coughlin as well.
Yeah. Of course, he was. He would fit into today's politics. He'd be fine. QAnon or whatever. You could say a prayer at the beginning of their meetings, so if they don't have somebody already. Can I move on to a question which, again, you could argue it's not a missing dimension, or if it's missing, it's because it just isn't part of the calculus, which is American thinking about Ireland in terms of a further war, given that America's experience of the First World War had to considerably extent been an Atlantic experience. And yet, from your work, I mean, the sea, in a sense, naval interest, maritime strategy doesn't get a mention. And I've looked up just quickly some things on American naval policy, and it's all Pacific. There's nothing to do with the Atlantic. There's nothing to do with lessons of submarine warfare. There's nothing to do with, no reflection on how handy Ireland had been as a base for American anti-submarine operations in the First World War. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. The American strategic defense and security interests in the early 1930s and into the mid 30s very much is focused on the Pacific, and really the Atlantic it features much less. Now, what's interesting is I was looking at some American military attaché reports in the last few days. And these were, the American military attaché was obviously based in London until World War II breaks out. But they made frequent visits, usually annually, around the RDS summer horse show. And they would visit Ireland, meet up with the Irish military authorities, political authorities, and report. And before the Anglo-Irish agreement, economic agreement, and obviously there's a defence pact in there, before 38, their reports are all on the poor state of the Irish military forces. There's no interest whatsoever in commenting on the strategic importance of Ireland vis-a-vis the Atlantic. So their comments relate to, poor quality personnel, poor quality uniforms, poor quality military equipment, great enthusiasm, great interest, and obviously some of the Irish officers had been trained in Fort 11 working places like that from the 1920s, and that's it. Now, after 1938, what you begin to see creeping into the reports a little bit is, and obviously before 37, when you do have any mention of the ports, it's well, the British are in control of those ports, and obviously British equipment there is modern, it's up to date, etc. Now, after 38, the comment is that, okay, the British have relinquished control of the ports, the Irish no longer have the protection of the British Navy, but what is the advantage of the agreement is that Britain will always have, quote, a friend. And of course, in Ireland, and of course that Ireland would now be able to supply Britain with all its food supplies, or most of them, in the event of war. So and there's no sense that the relinquishing of the ports would weaken British security, or indeed, the Irish security arrangements such as they were. So really, the interest in the American interest in Ireland in strategic terms really doesn't begin to take off until after war is declared, when there are then those long discussions about the shape of the belligerent zone, the combat zone, and whether Ireland would be in or out of that. There's no question in Washington that in fact Ireland would be included in that zone, and therefore there could be no British shipping in at all. So really, the Ireland is considered the whole time in the context of British security.
Yeah, no, but I think that's really interesting in terms of American history of American sort of naval planning as well. That they're just, it's not as though they ever sent an assistant naval attaché over from London or anything. They just didn't look at that side of the water, as it were, or that ocean, or certainly the North Atlantic, as being almost any of their business. Even though the experience of the First World War had been, they were the trade lifeline and so on. I thought it's interesting from an American point of view as well as from an Irish point of view, and of course a British point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing. In a sense, there's the absence of kind of historical memory about the US. Now, obviously, Ireland was part of the empire during First World War, but that historical memory of the locations that they'd been in, Queenstown, Wexford, etc., that doesn't feature at all in those reports. Now, one of the things that I wondered about then as well is that the military attachés are based in London. And Dublin is always seen as, and was from the 19th century, as that kind of outpost. I mean, it's seen in the same way as Newcastle or wherever. And so therefore, nothing wrong with Newcastle, but it was a consular. So it's kind of an outpost. And therefore, you get the sense that the military attaché is really only coming over, filling in the forms, sending back reports, enjoying himself at the RDS horse show, with no great interest in what's happening in Ireland until 1938-39. and then it
And even
changed.
then, I mean, the U.S. Army wouldn't have been looking out for the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Air Force because their relations were so fragmented to different parts
Yeah.
of American defense establishment. Not like
Yeah,
now.
and then even after October 39, the discussion about American air interests in Ireland focuses on fines, and there is that
Yeah,
discussion in this sort of November, December 39. It focuses on fines, but only in the context of re-establishing the commercial travel. And one
yeah,
trip of Pan Am is a big
yeah.
mover in having the fines link air link being re-established.
Yeah, which is a civilian thing, as you said. Yeah, I wondered, do we have questions? I'm just, they haven't turned up in my chat box. I think they're going to be referred to me as they come in, but I do urge people to put questions in,
Mm.
which in the meantime, I'll ask a few more. One of the dimensions, if you look at this from an American point of view, and Ireland's a small state, and it's one of many small states with which the United States has to deal with, small new states. It's not this unique little emerald gem that the Irish see themselves of. But one sort of common thread in terms of new states and old states for America after 1918 is Bolshevism, communism, as this international kind of virus, along with the Watchtower movement, curiously. It's something which they fear,
Mm.
sort of, that all civilized states, new and old, fear. And can you just mention to what extent, if at all, there was a fear of Bolshevism or communism in relation to Ireland or the Irish Republican left and things like that?
Mm. Yeah, from my earlier work as well, it was very clear that from 1919 onwards, there's a heading and a category in all reporting forms from that the American officers have to fill out is the state of communism in a particular country. And so therefore in Ireland, the to synopsize it always is there's a small left, but that small left will never grow because of the dominance of Catholicism. Now in the 1930s, as we know, when the Republican Congress, which are large, and then the Communist Party of Ireland are established, they're still not terribly concerned because by then De Valera, who had been tainted and regarded, followed by the Secret Service when he was in the US, etc., and comes up in G2 reports, the US military intelligence, and then what becomes the FBI. He comes up in those reports as a Sinn Féin radical who is a communist. Now, by the 1930s, he's proven himself not to be, and he's very much on the side of anti-communism. So therefore, when there is this kind of semi-revival of communism and communist activity in Ireland in the kind of mid to mid 1930s, they're not concerned. The American diplomats are not in any way concerned about it. And what's interesting is another piece I've been working on, which is going to come out as an article soon in Irish Historical Studies, is Ireland and the Moral Rearmament Movement, or which was the Oxford group, and they were very much an anti-communist activity, a grouping that came out of a guy called Frank Bachman, an American, and their view, they were trying to promote the whole idea of kind of appeasement, but moral appeasement as well. And that grouping begins to get a bit of a foothold in Ireland in the 1930s. So the American diplomats, when they look at communism in Ireland, they're not fearing anything. And even then, when you take it on after 1945, when the Marshall Plan begins to kick in 47, one of the reasons why Ireland, does get some funding despite neutrality, is because it is seen as part of the defence against communism, and would obviously then fit into the pro-democratic group of countries and the America's allies. So it is a constant theme. It's always been monitored, but it never causes any difficulty.
Okay, we have a question. Thanks for that, and I would love to go on about that, but I better let other people in. A questioner says, "Thanks for interesting discussion." Blah blah. Interested in your comments about the huge imbalance in consular resources between the two countries. Did the actual trade between the two countries reflect this imbalance, or did actual trade activity occur separately from the world of diplomacy?
No, as I said at the beginning, I think trade activity is very much part of the Irish diplomatic and consular activity. I mean, it's obviously a core activity for consular agents, but because of the size of the service in America, trade is important. And just to quickly summarize really what was involved there, the trade imbalance was 13-1 in America's favor. So Ireland in the 1930s never exported more than about 200,000 sterling worth of goods to America, imported about, sometimes it could be 2 million. So it was a huge imbalance. There was constant attempts to try and negotiate a trade agreement between America and Ireland, and De Valera very much favoured that as an alternative to losing the British markets because of the economic war. The negotiations, they weren't negotiations. Approaches started in 1934. And it isn't until 1938 when Secretary Hull agrees that they would open preparatory negotiations. An agreement is never signed until 1949. So the trade agreement part of it was one aspect of the consular and the diplomatic activity. The other aspects were trade promotion and trade protection. Trade promotion was difficult because the quality of Irish trade, the way the quality of the products, the timing of the products, delays in getting material, and was a huge issue for the Irish who were trying to promote their to sell Irish import markets, the import of Irish goods into the States. In terms of trade protection, that's an interesting one because they devoted a lot of time, particularly Matthew Murphy in San Francisco, to try and deal with this issue of mislabeling. So you would have Irish tweed, Irish stout, Guinness, whiskey, all of which was being made in America or made in China, and the Irish Kilkenny, Dublin brands all being used inaccurately and illegally. And he eventually does get legislation through in 4 or 5 Western American states to try and combat that. So he was working with, consumer rights people, and obviously it was an issue for the FDR administration as well to try and improve consumer products and consumer services. So the trade aspect was quite important but in their core activity, their core aim, which was to get a trade agreement, they never ever got it in the 1930s period.
Right. Keith Snell asks, quote, can you say anything about Irish-US discussion about continued Irish emigration to the United States, especially in relation to the aftermath of the Great Slump? Are there any enduring and still relevant lessons for Irish dealings with the USA or vice versa from this account and period?
Yeah, immigration, as I said, I have a chapter in the book on immigration, and I think obviously the core, even though the whole period of mass migration ends in 1930, 1930 is when we see just 800 Irish emigrating to the States on quota visas. But so that mass migration that started in the 19th century finally ends then. However, that doesn't mean that the consular work suddenly decreases. What they're now dealing with is the generational change in Irish America. All those Irish Americans who were now in a position of either wanting to return to Ireland or had died and left substantial estates. And so the work really increases. As I said, during the Depression, when distress hits, the amount of extradition work, the amount of deportation work, distress cases, hugely expands. And the Irish consular officers in the States have an awful lot of activity in that regard. Indeed, even providing some of their own money, providing cups of tea and coffee and some sustenance to some of the people who come to their door. In reverse, the American officers in Dublin obviously have very little to deal with. Their major activity, now there is an increase in distress cases. These would be American naturalized citizens who are in Ireland during the 1930s and want to return to the States. Because remember, they're not allowed work in Ireland under the Aliens Act. So a lot of them are trying to return to the States. They have to deal with those cases. The other core of their activity relates to distributing pensions checks. These would be to people men and their families who had fought in the First World War, and indeed even in earlier wars. Some of the relatives were still alive, and so they're distributing those checks. The other aspect of that work would be compensation. These were insurance claims that had been made in the States for people, Irish, American citizens, and they're coming back to their Irish relatives. And then they had what they called whereabouts work, where they were always trying to find the details for people who had inherited in the States, who were heirs, and they now had to be found in Ireland. So in terms of the more general principle of having to deal with restrictive immigration, and legislation, which is quite close to today's experience, the Irish officials in the States, they never argue for an increase in the legislation at all, or in the quota that Ireland is given. There's a reduction in the Irish quota under Hoover, but that quota is never fully taken up, because the Irish very quickly realise, and I think this is another of the key lessons, is those networks of communication. You know, within 6 months of the Wall Street crash, it's very clear that the Irish are reorientating themselves towards British markets and towards finding work in Britain. Right. And I think that's an interesting aspect.
Right. We have a question in and comment from Noel Fahey, who was, of course, an Irish ambassador to the United States not so long ago. And Noel says, very interesting talk. He was a bit late joining and looks forward to your book. He says, De Valera had his obvious special relationship with the US. He was born there and he had a history there during the War of Independence, most of which, of course, he spent in America. Do you have any evidence that De Valera had a separate network apart from the legation and consulates that he would have used?
Yeah, good point. He was very close to Martin Convoy, and Convoy was the legal officer who had put him in touch, in fact, with Roosevelt, who had given him advice when they were launching the Valera bonds in 1919, 1920. Convoy then stayed as a legal advisor to FDR, and he was one of the people that McQuite thought would get a position within the Roosevelt administration. That doesn't happen, but he remains very close to him. And so Convoy and De Valera are pretty close. The other relationship would be that De Valera maintains in the period is through Senator Joseph Connolly, who visits the States a lot, and he gets access to he actually meets Roosevelt 3 or 4 times in 1933 when Roosevelt takes over. So he had those communication networks. De Valera is also.
I think, sorry, Noel's just reiterated his point about network of contracts, which I think is distinct from these singular links.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Catholic network, but there's no great evidence of a persistent Catholic communication, Irish American Catholic communication with De Valera. I didn't see any great evidence of that in the De Valera papers.
Right, I see.
Maybe he has something else in mind.
Well, no, but I think that's very interesting. But while we wait for another question, can I ask you a quick question about Canada, which you may remember where Canada is. It's sandwiched between Alaska and the rest of the United States, and it too was has Irish resonances and Irish links. And does Dublin think at all much about representation in Canada in the 30s? Because again, it's a fairly fluid border and all these kind of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Canada is important also in terms of the Commonwealth as another self-governing dominion. So I think there is that closeness of relationship that's there. And, anytime, as we know, that De Valera wants to, when he begins dismantling the treaty, the London government's appeal to the Canadian and South African to try and temper his expectations down a bit and his actions. On the ground, when we look at it, obviously John Delanthe was appointed to Canada, and I think it's Owsley who says, or Cuddy, Delanty's a good man. He's very much pro-America. And obviously Delanthe had been the legal advisor in the Irish Department of External Affairs for a while. So there is a view that having Delanthe in Canada is helpful. On the ground in the States, McQuite builds very close relationships with the Canadians. And he does it deliberately, in other words, to try and share as much information as much as possible. But when De Valera gets in, he wants to emphasize, and Brennan follows through on this, that Ireland is not should not be seen in the same league as a kind of Commonwealth gang around the British embassy, and part of the welcoming and the reception set the whole time. And so therefore De Valera tries to move Mac White away from associating too much with the Canadians. But Mac White does have good personal relationships with the Canadian ministers in Washington, and goes and visits and has holidays as well with them in their own home places.
And does he ever call into Norman Robertson or whoever to be in Ottawa? Is there any sort of unofficial official sort of hello?
No, and from 1931 onwards, Walsh, the Cosgrave, and then De Valera keep a very close rein on the activities of the Irish minister in Washington. There's a whole document of directions that they give to Mac White as to who he should and shouldn't be visiting, and who should be on his list of priorities in terms of entertaining people. And the Commonwealth and the Canadian minister in particular are very low down on that. And they really only feature in terms of entertaining as part of the diplomatic corps. So they couldn't be excluded. Yeah.
Right. And to go back to the Phoenix Park, is there a parallel? Are we being shut up?
I'm afraid that it does fall to me. I have the job of having to draw the conversation to a close because we're nearly out of time. I didn't want to interrupt you mid-sentence, Eunan. So do you finish that thought and then?
Well, I was just going to ask the question of what were the writing instructions, if any, for successive American diplomats in Ireland in terms of who they should contact? Because obviously in the war, De Valera gets very annoyed about David Gray being all kind of country house and Anglo-Irish and so on. I'm just wondering, was there any particular guidance given, or were they just told to take their chances?
I'll answer that one quickly and say that they all knew which unions to join. They all knew which hunts they wanted to hunt in. And it's a theme that continues right through into the 1960s.
And you don't mean trade unions, of course.
Oh, I don't.
No. Okay, sorry. Thank you very much.